Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you indeed for joining us on our fourth webinar, I think in the last 2 weeks, our second one of Cloud More Important Than Ever. You may have the unfortunate ability to see myself and Richard, so we shall wave at you. And so listen, we hope this session should last maximum 45 minutes. There'll be a time at the end for some Q&A, and what we've been doing through these webinars is also trying to get some kind of participation and some feedback. So we'll have a few polls as we go through the webinar. But I suppose really how we want to open up is talking about the new world. And it's an interesting one because only a few months ago we were talking about Brexit and how will businesses cope with leaving Europe. And yet within a matter of weeks, the governments all over the world were implementing lockdowns, quarantines. We were learning new language like social distancing. And basically, I thought this was a very interesting statement from Cloud Tech that the ongoing pandemic, I mean, for all of us, I suppose the way we looked at it, we had gone from 3 physical locations, Peterborough, Lisburn and Glasgow, to 103 locations with all our people working remotely. And we couldn't have done that without cloud, where we firmly believe, as slickly and as quickly and as being as agile. And I thought this quote highlighted it very well. The ongoing pandemic demonstrates how cloud computing has become essential in the modern world. Many of the conveniences and services, whether it be from gaming or just email, but it's all come around, and from the productivity piece, this is the new norm for a lot of us. And I know that when there's going to be a gradual lifting, remote working is probably a much bigger feature now going forward as to how we're going to work. So if we go on to the next slide, like many of us, we probably had to look at how can we keep the business turning and how can we keep people engaged and ultimately work remotely. And I remember well, on the 18th of March, we decided, right, we need to transition. And I think I touched on it earlier. We went from 3 physical offices to 103 offices. And that had its challenges. And I suppose this is our first question that we wanted to ask you in our first poll. How was it for you? So for those of you that did transition to remote working, how easy did you find that transition? So if we pop up with our questions. So it's very simple. These polls were just keeping open for about 30 seconds. So I just see a typo there. Easy, no hassles at all. Apologies for that. Or not easy. And it took us a time to get there. And that's an important one, because will we have to reenact this again, or a portion of that? That's going to be a big question. So if we get your feedback.
Results are quite interesting, very different from the last session, which is interesting. We're going to leave it open just for another couple of seconds. There's a couple of votes still coming through. Okay, that's us. Thank you very much, everyone. So 63% of the webinar attendees said that it was easy. There was no hassles at all, while 38% said it wasn't easy. It took a little bit of time to get there. So thanks again for your feedback.
Thank you. Okay, so if I sort of cover the agenda of what we're really wanting to, Richard and I hope to take you through brief introductions. You've met myself and Richard. Collectively between us, we've worked in the IT industry for, I would say, near on 50 plus years. I've only been in the IT industry for 2. Richard's been there a lot longer than me. But what we wanted to do was give you a brief introduction to cloud. And I appreciate some of the audience, you might be all over cloud. For others, it might be, well, we'd like to understand it better. So hopefully you'll bear with us. But we wanted to cover the cloud, just give you a bit of an overview of the cloud computing models, as not all models are the same. And then sort of talk about the different deployment options. But ultimately, where we're leading to in this is there's a new world norm. And for us, it's all about preparing for business change and some of the things that we had to go through. as an IT organization, but ultimately finish up on really 5 steps that we see at a very high level of how an organization can look at to gain cloud attainment. And then we'll finish up with, we'll open up for Q&A. Okay, but now I shall hand over to Richard to give you his brief introduction to cloud.
Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. So we're going to keep it really simple, a brief introduction to cloud. Cloud computing is the practice of using effectively third-party infrastructure to host your files, your folders, and applications within a data center environment. So effectively, that is a purpose-built building. There are over 300 of these buildings in the United Kingdom alone. We ourselves are based in a number of data centers in Belfast and London, and fundamentally it gives you the capability to work from any device and from any location. In most cases, the adoption of cloud can also reduce costs, improve business resilience and uptime, and also introduce previously unattainable levels of redundancy and to simplify internal support needs. The benefits of cloud have been known obviously for a substantial amount of time. It is a well-established technology. So just to clarify then what a data center is. So as I mentioned, a data center is a purpose-built facility which provides the physical space, for example, for the server racks where the equipment is located, the power, the cooling, and the necessary connectivity for internet service providers such as Experian and private businesses to operate their infrastructure from a secure, centralized location. In the UK, as I mentioned, we have over 300. However, they do vary greatly in terms of capabilities, such as choice of connectivity providers, security standards, the age of the building, the technical capability of the support teams that work within those companies, and obviously the technologies and the services that they provide. So we have our cloud platform. The cloud platform lives in a physical building called the data center. And within that cloud platform, a majority of our customers would utilize a virtual desktop environment, also known as desktop as a service. So it's the same desktop that you access on your laptop or your PC or your Mac, but it's available from any location, and that desktop is hosted in the cloud rather than on your physical device. It's typically delivered through Windows Remote Desktop or Citrix and provides users with a highly tailored desktop environment that's hosted in the cloud and the data center so they can access their files, their folders, and their applications. Obviously, as you can guess, there's a number of significant benefits here, but it allows employees to work from any device, any location. It standardizes the working environment. So you're standardizing security policies, user permissions, applications, and best of all, and in most cases, the environment and the infrastructure is managed by the internet service provider rather than your in-house IT teams. But it can be. It just varies by business. So, as I mentioned earlier, data centers do vary significantly. So here I've outlined some basic features of what I will call a modern data center. And these are actually the specifications of a data center based in London. It's called Vertus London 1. So as you can see, from a facilities perspective, we're looking for 24/7, 365 operations, which are absolutely essential. N+1 is a term that you'll see used regularly throughout today's webinar session. N+1 means that for everything, you have one extra, your spare. So for example, if you think of your own premise hardware, you might have a firewall. An N+1 firewall environment would mean that you've got a live firewall and a backup firewall. So in a data center environment, everything should be N+1 at a bare minimum. And that's from power, cooling, chilled water systems, internet connectivity, etc. And the idea is that if there is a failure, it has no impact on your working day. And if it's done right, it should be completely transparent. To put that into perspective, last year, Vertus, based in London, as I mentioned, they suffered a mains disconnect. So the power that comes into UK homes and businesses operates at a very precise frequency. And last year, that frequency became very erratic. So Vertus took the decision to disconnect from the mains power, and they ran for approximately a day and a half on diesel generators and batteries. That's a very complex process to transition tens of thousands of servers across to battery and diesel generator power, but if it is done right, again, it's completely transparent. And those are the types of facilities that provide services ultimately for the largest cloud platforms worldwide. So it's the same specification that you would find with the likes of Amazon Web Services, Google Compute, etc., etc. We then have certification. Certifications are absolutely essential. Compliance regulatory needs are changing quite significantly and have done over recent years. If we just think about the introduction of GDPR, for example, you know, certifications have never been as important as they were in the past. So we're looking for those internationally recognized standards. A good example would be what's known as 27001-2013, which is the international standard for information security management. It's an incredibly complex and detailed framework that this provider has had to adhere to. They've had to put extensive measures in place to comply with it, such as business continuity plans, backup systems, continuity of services, and then they have gone through a very thorough third-party audit who's confirmed that they are compliant. So again, information security management is a very, very important certification. Others are beneficial. They may tie into your corporate standards, environmental management, for example. And then we also have security. Security is very tightly linked to certifications ultimately, but if you're hosting your data and your equipment in some cases in a physical data center, security is going to be absolutely essential. So again, you want 24/7, 365 on-site security teams. You want physical, electronic, biometric security systems. So for example, that could include fingerprint scanners to gain access to certain rooms, corridors, or areas of the building. You may have retina scanners for higher profile areas, for example, data halls that may host government or financial data, and obviously the basics, internal and external CCTV, car parks, vehicle traps, etc., etc. Patrick's going to take you through the three types of main provider, and then I'll pick up again with you shortly.
Thank you for that, Richard, because hopefully, guys, you're starting to see that not all data centers are the same, and again, there's a myriad of different types of provider as well. So if we take the first one, the data center provider, Richard touched on that, like Vertus. Vertus is where we would have our equipment in, and Vertus itself was a purpose-built building. Speaking only for Vertus, it's whilst we have the diesel generators as backup, actually our servers are powered 100% by renewable energy. So depending on the age of the data center, it will dictate the sort of functionality of the features that it will have. But typical data center providers, Equinix, Telehouse, say Vertus, Rapid Switch. You then come into, if you like, the more interesting side between infrastructure solution providers like ourselves or resellers. And I suppose what we would classify as an infrastructure provider would be an organization that actually they rent the space, if you like, within the data center, but they're actually provisioning with their own equipment. They manage everything. So again, speaking from our perspective and from our experience, we manage all the servers, all the network devices, and we're ultimately responsible for everything within that platform. Other organizations like that, famous ones like Microsoft and Google and Amazon Web Services, as well as Rackspace. You then have, if you like, the next tier down, which would be the resellers. So these are maybe startups or smaller IT providers who will rent out or resell someone else's platform or someone else's equipment. And I suppose that introduces a third person in the chain, but it is obviously an easy option for potentially web developers and web designers who can just spin up and utilize what they need, or startups. So again, if you're going to market to look at cloud provision, cloud providers, be mindful that not all data centers are the same, and again, not all cloud providers are the same. And it's important to understand where the differences are. Now, what I was going to do is now move on and talk about if you like, the different types of cloud computing models. And again, some of these are probably very familiar to you, but we just wanted to give an ultimate overview. I suppose the one that we're probably all most common or familiar with would be software as a service. And the best way to describe that is that you've no server hardware to deploy or manage. You're ultimately entering into a subscription-based model. A typical example of that would be Microsoft Office 365 or Xero Financials or Salesforce. So they're all typical models of a software as a service. It's almost getting to the type of a mobile phone contract where you're just paying monthly for as a subscription for what you use. And the advantages of that is, you're tend to be evergreen. As Microsoft update their Office 365, you get the latest releases, etc. They look after the tin that runs the Office 365, etc. So you've nothing to really worry about. The next model up would be known as infrastructure as a service, or IaaS. And that's, I suppose, again, speaking from our experience, where we would typically sit, where you're deciding, well, do I actually want any on-premise servers, or do I want to start moving my server requirements into the cloud? And again, you're looking to ultimately leverage the dedicated secure virtual environments, the compliance that Richard talked about, the resilience, the N+1, and ultimately that can be dictated by client requirements or business requirements. But you're ultimately then, as a bit like software as a service where it's a subscription, this takes it to the next level where you can scale up and scale down depending on how the business dictates. I mean, a classic example would actually be our current COVID-19 situation, where maybe people have had to furlough staff, and it's allowed them to scale down on their licensing requirements. It's allowed them to change their billing model whilst we go through this change and current circumstance. And the final, probably popular one or well-known one, would be platform as a service. And this is ultimately where you have someone else manages the whole platform. You don't need to worry about it again, but it tends to be geared towards larger organizations and developers, so web developers, software developers, and this just gives them the ability to be very agile, spin up servers for a very short period of time to maybe test or whatever, and it's there just to give them those guys flexibility to really have IT needs on tap. So they're ultimately the three types of cloud computing model.
So we have a slight error on that sheet, unfortunately, which I've just noticed. So I just want to clarify. Software as a service is absolutely fine. Buy a subscription, use the software remotely, easy peasy. Infrastructure as a service is where you can choose to deploy a single server. So for example, if you just want to host a single line of business applications such as Sage, the features and the benefits that are listed under platform as a service, the features that are listed under platform as a service are actually features of infrastructure as a service. So again, it's very simple to deploy a server. You have everything under one roof. It's customizable. However, with platform as a service, it's where you need to have a private environment. So that's where the dedicated secure virtual environments come in, improved performance, resilience, and redundancy, and the significant security and compliance benefits. So infrastructure as a service is effectively public cloud. It can be utilized by absolutely everyone, typically paid monthly on subscription, a very cost-effective solution. Platform as a service would be for enterprise or large businesses who require dedicated and highly customized solutions. Not sure that's happened, so apologies for that. I'll blame Patrick just to be safe.
Well, listen, if we move on to the next slide, Richard, this will give the guys, I suppose, how we would look at it in terms of inputs that your local IT manager would need. So if we take the first scenario on the left, which is your traditional on-premise, if we look from the bottom up, your networking, switches, firewalls, routers, storage, servers, etc., they would be what we would call they're typically self-managed. The IT manager, you either manage it yourself or you have a support contract with a provider that will manage it for you. But ultimately, it's up to you to make sure that it runs and it works well. Whether you subcontract that out or not, it doesn't matter. It has to be self-managed. As we move across from left to right, infrastructure as a service, you'll see there that the provider of infrastructure as a service will look after the networking, the storage, the servers, the virtualization, but then leave it to the IT manager to manage everything else. And then moving across platform as a service, as Richard said earlier, it's typically for larger organizations, but all they're really focusing on is potentially the data and the applications, designing the apps. And then finally, software as a service. Literally, it's a subscription based. You have no engagement with the servers, the storage. It's all done for you. So it sort of tries to give a very high level overview between what needs to be self-managed versus no management at all. So we go on to our second poll question, and really based on just what we've covered now, which of the three cloud models, computing models, do you believe would be best suited to your organization? So which of the three cloud computing models do you believe are best suited to your organization? Software as a service, infrastructure as a service? Maybe you should have had platform in there, Richard, but or just don't know. Again, would welcome your feedback, folks. And we'll keep this going for.
Yeah,
went ahead, Richard.
Pretty quickly. Okay, still got a couple more in. We'll give it another couple of seconds. Okay, that's us. Thank you, everyone. So 43% selected software as a service, 29% selected infrastructure as a service, and 29% said they didn't know or they simply wanted to express their dissatisfaction for the missing option.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Right, before I hand over to Richard, there was one more area I wanted to cover with you guys is about the cloud deployment, because okay, we've covered not every data center is the same, not every cloud model is the same. Cloud deployment, and Richard talked about this earlier, touched on it, I suppose. You have three main types. You have public, private, and hybrid. And public is probably the easiest way that I can explain that. Public it's the most common way of deploying any form of cloud computing. So the cloud resources, servers, they're owned and operated by a third party, but they're virtualized and shared out among multiple tenants. So Office 365 is a classic example of a public cloud. And a lot of our clients that are in our cloud platforms, it would be a form of public cloud. So it allows organizations to easily replace legacy on-prem hardware, do it bit by bit. It also changes the way of initially having to look at, do I have one big capital expenditure, or is this a way of me moving across into a pay-as-you-go almost style model? But it's also, Richard touched on this in terms of the N+1 resilience, the security, and ultimately leveraging some of that compliance that you would have within a data center. Private cloud is probably, it'll be more dictated by compliance or regulatory requirements, and we would see this quite often with insurance, health, or financial organizations, where really what they're doing is they ultimately are the only ones residing on the physical tin within the data center, and it is very much private. They're the only tenant. And I suppose in lay terms, the way I would sometimes compare public to private is Public could be a smashing apartment block where you're sharing the lift, the water, the heating, etc. You're sharing the perimeter security if you like to get into the apartment block and accessing the lifts. And then you have your own passcode to get into your apartment, so it still is secure. Whereas private cloud is ultimately, your own gate lodge. You're the only tenant in that property, and you have your perimeter security and your own personal security. So that's typically the difference. And what dictates it quite often is going to be compliance or the needs of the client's customers. And I say it's typically banking, insurance, or health. And then you would have hybrid. And hybrid can be multiple things. It's a bit like our opinion poll before then about software as a service, where some of you might already have a hybrid IT model where you've software as a service for your Office 365, but you still have on-prem servers. But in the cloud world, you may actually have some data residing in a private cloud, but you're also leveraging a public cloud. And again, it could well be, if we take some of those financial organizations where their core applications are in a private cloud environment, but their emails, etc., are all within Office 365. And again, below you'll see some of the various benefits, but the majority of it is allowed. Some people will use this to migrate piece by piece onto a cloud platform, but it ultimately is allowing you across all three to leverage resilience, to leverage security, and ultimately as well is maybe potentially tick boxes in terms of compliance.
So if we had to tie these platforms back to the three models that we covered earlier, public cloud would typically be known as infrastructure as a service. Private cloud is typically platform as a service. And our hybrid cloud can be a mixture of everything. It's on-premise infrastructure as a service, software as a service, and platform as a service as well. So ultimately, from a cloud perspective, we have data centers. Data centers are incredibly important. They provide us with the facilities. They provide us with the security that we need. It provides us with a level of redundancy, which now is more important than ever. If a provider, whether it be BT or Virgin Media, for example, didn't have levels of redundancy built into their infrastructure, should a failure occur at any point, then obviously you'd be experiencing extended outages, because our ability to have engineers traveling across the country is still very, very limited. And that applies to every single technical organization throughout the country. So that level of redundancy is very, very important. So to this point, cloud is allowing us to be more productive, more agile, more resilient, accessible, mobile, and more secure. Ultimately, it boils down to the fact that we're trying to maximize performance, reliability, and functionality whilst negating all of the traditional capital expenditure associated with on-premise hardware and day-to-day management. It's digital transformation. However, the elephant in the room is that we all need to prepare for the new world, and cloud's more important than ever because it allows us to leverage all of those areas that we've covered. To help you prepare for the change, we've identified some areas of focus, some things possibly that you may not have thought of. So the idea is to try and make you challenge yourself and to think about what may need to be done. What have you done? Have you missed anything? So we'll not go through these, we'll not go through all of them. We'll pick a couple of the important ones. So the first one we'll select is server hardware. The questions we had to ask ourselves and the questions that our customers have been asking is, first and foremost, is it fit for purpose? Do we have valid warranties and service packs so that if something happens whilst we're working remotely, we can get the support that we need, whether it be through IBM, Dell, Lenovo, etc.? Was it designed with growth? And fundamentally, was it designed with remote working in mind? Do we have any form of resilience, redundancy to cope with potential failures? And how do our employees work remotely if a server failure was to occur? Effectively, what's our plan B? If we then look at other things, such as backups, the questions that we need to ask are we protected? Are they working? Have they been tested, and when were they most recently tested? Are we backing up absolutely everything? So if you deployed a backup system last year, 2 years, 3 years ago, whatever it may be, things have changed in your business. New users have arrived, some may have left. You may have replaced your server, you may have added a new server. When was your backup configuration last checked? Are you backing up absolutely everything? It's one thing to know that your backup was successful, and it's one thing to test it. But when you go to use it, you may find that you're missing a very small part. So doing a backup audit is absolutely essential. Now's a great time to do it. Firewalls and security are equally, if not the most important thing on the list here. Is your business secure? Are your remote workers secure? And have you taken all of the necessary steps required to mitigate any unnecessary risk? Getting your business through the coronavirus outbreak is going to be challenging for everybody, but should you suffer a security breach in the interim, it may simply prevent you from operating your business on a day-to-day basis. There are a lot of simple measures that you can take to try and mitigate a vast majority of that risk. For those of you that joined us for our avoidable security risks of remote working session a couple of days ago, we have created quite detailed checklists that you can work through to say, have we done this? Have we done that? It'll help you understand what you need to check. Security threats have increased dramatically. For those of you that may have watched the Downing Street briefing yesterday, it was obviously highlighted that there is a number of ongoing threats and attacks. The US and UK joint statement obviously has highlighted that education, healthcare primarily, and research organizations are currently under attack. The fact of the matter is every single business is under attack. Phishing emails related to COVID-19 have increased by 30,000% this year compared to last. It is absolutely incredible. And that is only a very small portion of the security landscape. Phishing emails are one thing. If you think of your internet connection in your office, it's just like the front door of your house. You'll find that tens of thousands of times a day, somebody will come along and they will knock on the door and they'll pull the handle and they'll see if they can get in. The same thing happens to your network, to your infrastructure every single day of the week. And in 99% of cases, they aren't even real people. They're other infected machines. Those other infected machines are trying to find more servers that they can exploit to help them reproduce, to infect more and more and more. So when you're out of the office, it's important to make sure that you're still adhering to regular maintenance schedules. When did you last update your firewall? When did you last update your servers, your desktops, your laptops? It's even more critical when your users are working at home. And I'm not going to cover this off in too much detail. You can join us for next week's webinar session. It's a fantastic opportunity to understand what we learned as part of our transition. But there's a lot of simple measures that you can take, and it applies regardless of whether you're on-premise, whether you're in the cloud, hybrid infrastructure, platform as a service. It makes no difference. It applies to absolutely all of us. So hopefully you find something useful there. And I'll transfer back to Patrick and he'll take you through the 5 steps to cloud attainment.
Thank you, Richard. And I suppose what got us thinking along this kind of webinar is, I know we've been in the IT industry now for 50 years and we have a myriad of clients from on-prem to hybrid to full cloud. And it got us thinking the fact that Experience is full cloud, we were able to transition overnight from 3 offices to 103. Whereas a lot of our on-prem clients, they might have had remote working set up for 2 or 3 users for maybe month-end accounts or for the odd dial in remotely at the weekend for the directors, but they weren't, the solutions had never been designed from the ground up to cater for potentially switching that and turning it on its head. And so we kind of felt, if we were looking at a cloud attainment model, what sort of steps would we suggest organizations take? I think the first one is create migration and capability checklist. And what we mean by that is looking ultimately at the applications that you're running and their level of cloud readiness. Can they live in a virtual environment? Is this the right place for them to be? Do they require to be on-prem because of their integration maybe with manufacturing equipment, CNC equipment, or just the age of the application? But also the capability of either your internal team with the skill sets that might be required to manage a cloud environment, or your ICT partner. Is this a space that they've lived in and one that they know well? So again, it's trying to understand not just the migration checklist of what you might need to lift and shift, but also the capability. And that really helps you understand data sizes and all the rest of it in terms of being able to migrate. The second then is to look at a suitable cloud model, public, private, or hybrid. We touched on this to say we have clients that are only private cloud because of the compliance and the legislation that they operate under. And the fact that they're assessed in that environment annually. But again, it can also be a toe in the water to initially start to slowly migrate by adopting potentially the public cloud environment and then moving across. Third step that we would recommend is establish your base performance and security policies. And what I mean by that is understanding what you're getting into. What's the service level agreements? What's going to be the performance? What's going to be the resilience? What's going to be the what if we're going public or we're going private? What can guarantees can we as a business gain? So that, because it's quite often it is that kind of trust, so that we know that those guys have our back, and it's also helping to set expectations within the organization. Once you've got your plan and your steps in place, you know exactly what way you're going to go, then migrate in measurable and manageable steps. Very, very rarely would you go big bang. You would like to try and have measurable steps that become part of a concise migration plan. And that does two things. It allows you to have freeze stages where you can pause, make sure that there's no adverse impacts to the business or the users. It helps set, again, user expectations within the organization. And it ultimately allows you to have sign off with the key stakeholders as you get through those delivery milestones. And then finally, it seems simple enough, but it's communicate changes within the organization. Because initially, sometimes an organization will migrate to the cloud, not necessarily to introduce new features or new efficiencies, but actually to de-risk the age of their existing equipment. So management maybe say, oh, we're spending this money to do a migration, but what are we getting for it? And they don't understand that ultimately on day one, they're getting N+1, they're getting the security, they're getting the resilience, and then they're getting the backup. But phase 2 and 3 of your migration plan might well be to drive additional efficiencies, because you're becoming more agile, you're opening up remote working, etc. So again, having clear, concise communication and communicating those changes within the organization helps keep everyone on board. Now, this is probably a very simplistic, and believe you me, we have project plans and migration plans that can go from anywhere from 50 to 150 steps. But again, if we were to put it into broad sections, these are the sections that they would be part of. So before we come to our final poll, we have one more slide really just to talk through some of the other areas in terms of how we see that organizations may be able to dip their toe in the water, so to speak, from a cloud presence. And I suppose if I cover the first one, Richard, from one of the most easy ones is probably data backups. And Richard touched on this as part of our, migration to remote working. Traditionally, if you have on-premise backups, you're checking the backups, the tapes or the cartridges, etc. But why not put another layer of resilience in and actually offload those backups to the cloud? A second point that maybe some of you are or may not be aware, Microsoft and Office 365 only have a retention policy. They do not have a backup policy. The retention policy is typically 90 days. So again, it may be well worth backing up your Office 365 because that's where a lot of us live. That's our filing cabinet with OneDrive, SharePoint, and our emails. So again, these can be areas that you can start to put your toe in the water from a backup. And we've just shared some of the technologies from a solution perspective that would allow you to do that. Veeam Backup and Replication, Veeam for Office 365, and Veeam Cloud Connect, etc. But then I'll hand over to Richard now to cover some of the other areas that allow you to put a toe in the cloud, a toe in the water of cloud, shall we say.
Yeah, so as Patrick mentioned, baby steps is the best way to do it. Veeam Backup for Microsoft Office 365 is absolutely essential. If you're using Office 365, it is very, very important that you get that put in place if you haven't done so already. Unfortunately, as you know, when you compare your traditional on-premise infrastructure or you compare your cloud infrastructure, when you migrate your data outside of your estate, you do lose control of it to an extent. So regardless of whether you're using Office 365 for email, for OneDrive, for SharePoint, it is really important to make sure that you're backing that up on a day-to-day basis. The next thing we have then is patch and asset management. So as I mentioned earlier, maintenance routines are still very, very important. In our business, we utilize a number of products, primarily our patch management as a service offering. And what we're doing is we are performing automated real-time scans every single day of the week, 24/7, 365. And we're identifying which application updates are outstanding, not just for Windows, not just for the operating system, but also up to 350 third-party applications. All the typical applications that IT managers typically forget about or don't have visibility of. That's the most important part. Making sure that users are updating Chrome, Firefox, Java, Adobe Reader, whatever it may be. Those applications are the weak link. Windows updates are typically automated. It's more challenging in the Windows 10 environment to restrict those. So typically they are being pushed out on a regular basis. Third-party applications will vary significantly by user. Micro patch management is a relatively new technology. It provides temporary patch fixes until the software developers can release a full patch. So if we take a product, for example, let's take Java. Java is notorious for security updates. If what's known as a zero-day vulnerability is identified, and that means that somebody has identified that there is a security vulnerability within Java, however, the software developers have not yet released a fix. Micro patch management allows third-party security experts to develop a temporary fix, which is applied as a sticky plaster, and then it's automatically unloaded whenever the software developers release a formal update. To put it into perspective, Patch Tuesday is infamous. Microsoft's patch release day. Just over a week and a half ago, they released 101 security updates in a single day. 15 of those were classified as critical, and 4 of them were for zero-day vulnerability fixes. So you can only imagine how important patch management is. Other ideas, other suggestions would be vulnerability scanning. So again, when we talked earlier about visitors knocking on the front door, attempting to pull the handle, vulnerability scanning does that on your behalf. So it automatically scans your office, your equipment to identify any potential vulnerabilities that may exist that would allow someone to gain unauthorized access. Monitoring, alerting, and analysis will allow you to monitor all of the hardware within your estate. So is it working properly? Are there potentially any failures, any issues, any predictive analysis that you can gain that might highlight a problem later down the line? And then you've got your Office 365 tools. So for collaboration and productivity, Office 365 ticks the box for pretty much everything, giving you your email, your file storage, and your collaboration tools. Best of all is delivered as software as a service. You then have customer insights and customer relationship management. And again, a cloud-based software as a service solution would include Dynamics 365, and then Business Central for any finance, for again, accounts and enterprise resource planning. So that brings us on to our final poll. I know you love questions. We're only going to open it again for 30 seconds. We'd greatly appreciate it if you take a moment just to provide us with some feedback. And the question that we have for you now is, knowing what you know now, do you believe that your business is truly ready for the new way of work? And again, we'll just throw this up for 30 seconds or so, and we'll see what sort of feedback that we get.
Yeah, I mean, appreciate your feedback, guys. And then we shall just a couple more slides. And I suppose for those of you that don't really know much about experience, well, we'll wait till the poll has finished. A few more seconds.
They're still coming in thick and fast. We've only got 2 more in the queue. We'll just let those complete, and then I'll give you a quick rundown of what we have. So slightly different from previous responses. We have 20% said yes, they're ready for the new world. 60% said no, and 20% said that they didn't know. So thanks again for your feedback. That is much appreciated.
Okay, so before we go on to questions, guys, just a couple of slides. Apologies about this. Just wanted, for those of you that didn't really know too much about experience, I mean, our focus really over the last few years has changed to really try drive business efficiencies, and digital transformation, I suppose, is a bandied term, but how we see it is how we can help organizations become more efficient, either through business processes, through their adoption of IT, and ultimately make them more agile and more responsive. And I think this whole pandemic has forced a lot of our clients and ourselves as well to look at, are we getting what we need to get out of our systems? Are we agile enough? And certainly how the technologies that we're now utilizing and really consuming heavily from the likes of Teams, etc., has really helped make us more efficient with the remote working. And for those of you that maybe know us from a Sage perspective or a Pegasus perspective of our infrastructure, I think it's important that we've 4 key areas to the organization. Cloud, we focus a lot on today, and as Richard said, on Tuesdays we have our how to avoid security risks of remote working. But again, what we try to be is the one phone call for a lot of our clients, where we can help them, whether it be through their ERP, whether it be through their CRM, or whether it be through their managed IT. So hopefully you've enjoyed the webinar. Hopefully it's given you a bit of food for thought, and you've maybe learned a wee bit more about us. And what we'd like to do now is open the floor to any questions. You can see at the panel there if you want to type in a question, and then Richard and I will do our best to answer them for you.
I guarantee I will answer every single question. I'm just not sure if it'll be the right answer. that red slide's quite interesting. It brings out the red in my eyes.
Yep.
That was a lot. Okay, so we've got a few things coming in. We're going to let this run for a while. We do like the really tough ones, so send them our way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to start off with that first one, Patrick?
Yep. Well, the first one we've got here is actually to do with connectivity. We have a question here about, cloud, and are you not heavily reliant on connectivity? And do we have any recommendations for types of connectivity? For those that you may or may not know, I mean, ultimately connectivity is key for cloud access, and ideally there's always a preference to have dedicated, because when you're on any kind of, if you have it at home, and maybe you've noticed this working remotely, basically, you'll have good days of performance, poor days of performance, and it's a bit like traffic on a motorway. And our typical broadband connections or fiber to cabinet connections, we share that with others. So it's a bit like the traffic on the road. Some days you can get gridlock, things move very slowly. Other days things move a lot faster, and that's typically what happens from a connectivity. So whenever we're talking to anyone, and we cover, I suppose as part of the migration plan, is we will look at the connectivity speeds that your business currently gets. And then we will look at that to say, right, how can that be improved? And ultimately the likes of BT Net, Daisy, Gamma will offer some very good packages to give you your own dedicated link to the internet. Imagine it as your own private motorway. But what I think the remote working that's been the government lockdown and people have had to work remotely, then you find that whilst you mightn't have the best internet connectivity in the business, people have maybe been able to access systems pretty well because they've got good connectivity at home. So, you know, ultimately, if you can get good connectivity, it makes a difference, but there's other ways and other options to look at that depending on where you are located.
So dedicated connectivity is not essential by any means. Obviously, broadband services and capabilities have increased dramatically in recent years. You'd be surprised at the cost of leased lines these days, which is the private highway that Patrick mentioned. They are incredibly cost effective. They do give you a guaranteed service level. That is ultimately the main selling point. But anybody can access cloud hosted applications, files, folders with a standard broadband connection. And the beauty of it is that if you lose your connection in the office, you can send everybody home and they can access everything, pick up from where they stopped using their home broadband connection.
Okay. Richard, do you want to take the next question?
I can't see that. Could you read it out for me?
Basically, who owns the data and what happens if I fall out with my internet service provider or my cloud service provider? It's two questions in one.
Okay, so ultimately you retain ownership of your data at all times. However, should a cloud provider cease to operate, regardless of whether that is Google, Azure, whoever it may be, that went dark. That was not planned. Regardless of who it may be, you need to always have a plan B. Part of your backup strategy should always be to have your data in multiple locations. So in the case of cloud, you should be backing up your data to a third party. There's various options available. For example, you could store it with Microsoft through Azure. You could replicate that data back to your office. You wouldn't be taking full copies of the virtual machines in most cases if you're doing a data center to office offsite backup, even if it is just for the files or folders. But it gives you peace of mind that should something happen, you have your data. You can put other measures in place to take a full copy of your entire environment, and that would give you the opportunity then to redeploy it or to spin that up effectively with another provider of your choice. Your data should typically be in 3 separate locations, or you should be using 3 separate backup methods. So data center to data center to a third-party data center, or data center to your office. And ideally, then you start to throw other minor complications into it, such as using different types of backup media. You know, everything from your traditional tapes through to cloud storage, OneDrive, Dropbox, etc., just to make sure that should an issue occur, that it doesn't impact all 3 sources of data at the same time.
Okay. I think that's us. I'm conscious of time. So we have our website there, and say next Tuesday, if you go onto the website, there are other webinars still running over this period of time, and say next Tuesday, Richard and I will be covering the avoidable security risks of remote working. So look, all it takes at this stage is for Richard and I to thank you very much for your attendance. I'll be sending out a feedback form, and then we'll be issuing after that a recorded copy of today's webinar if you'd like to share with any staff or friends or colleagues or family over the weekend. So have a great bank holiday weekend. Thank you again for your time, and everyone take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.